When the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth?
Lord, I believe, help thou mine unbelief.
May our testimonies be as deep and as strong as that of Jacob, who, when confronted by one who sought to destroy his faith, declared, I could not be shaken.
Chapter 5, we see the aftermath of this incredible call to personal strength. Right after this, if I perish, I perish. Right after this, I've come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Right after this combination of faith and great anxiety, it's time for her to face the king. This was probably the longest 3 days of their lives as they are fasting and weeping and mourning and praying and worshiping and hoping against hope that they'll survive this. But the third day comes. And on the third day, what will we find? Life or death? In chapter 5, verse 1, now it came to pass on the third day that Esther put on her royal apparel. She will look the part of a queen. She stood in the inner court of the king's house, over against the king's house. She's in the middle of the lion's den, so to speak. And the king sat upon his royal throne in the royal house, over against the gate of the house. Okay, Esther, you've entered the king's sacred space. Am I worthy to be here? There's all kinds of beautiful temple possibilities here to consider as we make application. As I come into this holy place, will the king be pleased to find me here? Am I worthy to stay? No 12 months of preparation this time. No odors, sweet savors, no myrrh. But is she prepared sufficiently to enter the presence of her king? In verse 2, and it was so, when the king saw Esther, the queen, standing in the court, and you can imagine her heart pounding in her chest, this sinking feeling in her stomach, this fear mingled with hope, she obtained favor in his sight. She was going to make it. The king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. So Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Probably hoped that the king wouldn't notice how much her fingers were trembling as she stretched out her hand. This reminds me of Jacob going to meet Esau for the first time in 20 years and bowing 7 times along the way and being so fearful that he was about to be annihilated. And yet, how does his brother react? What's with all the gifts? What's with the fear, little brother? And throws his arms around him and weeps upon his neck and treats him as an older brother of any prodigal should. And as our older brother, the older brother of all of us prodigals, surely will if we are humble and repentant. It's so understated there in verse 2, but this is the moment of Esther's personal deliverance. If I perish, I perish. I didn't perish. I got the exception, not the rule. I got the if it be so instead of the but if not. And God came through for me. And now I pray that I, with God's help, can help my people come through as well. In verse 3, the king says to her, what wilt thou, Queen Esther? You come dressed as a queen. Oh, you look the part, my dear. What can I do for you? What is thy request? It shall be even given thee to the half of the kingdom. It's amazing how much she underestimated the king's feelings for her. And I would add, I'm sure we do the same when it comes to the King of Kings. As we fearfully approach him, instead of coming boldly to the throne of grace, so afraid that he will reject us, And yet it's not just a golden scepter he's holding out. It's his arms of mercy that he's extending. Please come. I want to give you more than half the kingdom. I want to give you all that the Father hath and share in that glory together. Well, in Esther's case, she didn't take the king's generosity for granted. She says in verse 4, if it seem good unto the king. So I'm going to let you make the decision here. I'm not going to presume upon your grace or make any demands that I'm undeserving of. But if it seem good, then please let the king and Haman come this day unto the banquet that I have prepared for him. Wait, that's it? You risked your life to come and invite me to a party? I mean, I am a fan of parties. The 6-month one, it was pretty epic, but that's all you wanted? And it's me as the guest of honor, and well, it's obvious I'm the king, but you want Haman to come too? Again, this is where I think Mordecai's perception comes in handy, since it was the king's signature and seal on that decree. But no, Haman's behind it, so we have to get Haman in front of this, in front of the king, in front of Esther, so we can confront him in terms of what he's done. Well, if that's all you want, then of course, that's easier than giving you half the kingdom. I'll come, and I'm sure that Haman will want to be there, since it's another promotion of sorts. They both come to Esther's banquet, and again, the king asks Esther, as before, what do you want? Surely it's not just to throw a party for us. I'm offering to give, and instead you give in return? No, what can you receive? What do you want? And her humble request, verse 8, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my petition and to perform my request, let the king and Haman come to the banquet that I shall prepare for them, and I will do tomorrow as the king hath said. So again, equally strange. What do you want? I just want another party. Day 2. I don't know if I'm going to keep this going for 180, but can we at least have a second day of feasting, of celebrating, of me honoring you and honoring Haman? It's interesting, again, to see the providence behind the scenes. Some things needed to happen on Haman's part and Mordecai's part before Esther exposed Haman for what he was and what he was doing. And so it needed to have another day for day 1 of banquet. It needed to have another day for day 2 of the banqueting. So interesting to see this inspiration on the part of Esther to extend things. I also love the way she phrased it. If I've found favor in your sight. There's a sense of personal worthiness or readiness to receive the blessings. And secondly, if it pleased the king to grant my petition, there's an understanding that it's not all up to us and what's God's will in all this. I love, we're going to see this 3 times from Esther. This balancing of, am I worthy to receive the miracle I'm hoping for? And is it God's will that I receive it? Because if either of those things is missing, then perhaps I'll miss the miracle. Interesting that she combines the two. Well, verse 9. Then went Haman forth that day joyful and with a glad heart. Now, can you just imagine how gleeful he would be that all the attention's on him? I and I alone are in the inner circle of the king and queen. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he stood not up nor moved for him, he was full of indignation against Mordecai. I mean, nothing worse than jealous pride getting in the way of selfish pride. I mean, it was the selfish pride that was making him feel so good about himself. Oh, me, I'm number 1 in the king's eyes. But then it was jealous pride that popped the bubble of his joy. That, but there's Mordecai. And, how can I rejoice in my superiority when he's not visibly admitting it? It's so interesting, so twisted, really, that someone so self-centered can't even rejoice in his own good fortunes if there's someone out there that isn't jealous of those good fortunes himself. I mean, C.S. Lewis wrote some amazing things about pride that President Benson quoted in his incredible talk about pride, for example. And pride isn't satisfied in having something. It just wants to make sure he has more of it than someone else. And that is Haman to a T. And to be so indignant, to replace joy with, it's this weird envy, this weird jealousy that just can't allow anyone not to recognize all that I have. And how can this nobody not recognize his nothingness in my presence? But what amazes me also is that Mordecai didn't change. To whatever degree he perceived that Haman was behind the decree, to whatever degree he perceived that it was his unwillingness to bow before Haman that may have brought on this wave of opposition, he didn't change. He would have said right alongside Esther, if I perish, I perish. I know God will preserve a righteous remnant somehow, and in the meantime, I'm going to be righteous myself, and I will not bow before him. In verse 10, though, let's get back to Haman. Nevertheless, Haman refrained himself. He's not going to take out Mordecai quite yet. He's got it already planned for D-Day on the 13th. But when Haman came home, he sent and called for his friends and Zeresh, his wife, and Haman told them of the glory of his riches, the multitude of his children, all the things wherein the king had promoted him, and how he had advanced him above the princes and servants of the king. I laugh at this degree of complete and utter self-absorption on Haman's part. I mean, if you're with your friends, do you really have to tell them about the glory of your riches all over again? They're aware. And if you're with your wife, do you really have to brag about the multitude of your children? She knows who they are. She knows who gave them to you. Oh, this incredible... Well, the second half, but you didn't know about that. And I just want to, anytime I bring up new sources of pride, I just want to reiterate the old ones so you don't forget. Do you have any idea who I am? How lucky you are to have me as your friend? How incredibly blessed you are to be my wife? To have me as your husband? Everyone's lucky to have me in their lives. Someday Mordecai will know it, maybe on his death day. The king knows it, he seems to. The queen knows it. I mean, she was inviting me and me alone to hang out with the royal family. And so I am rising higher and higher and higher in everyone's estimation. In verse 12, Haman said, moreover, yea, Esther the queen did let no man come in with the king unto the banquet that she had prepared, but myself. And tomorrow am I invited unto her also with the king. Yet all this availeth me nothing so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. So there it happened again. And right in the midst of my prideful revelry, I thought of someone who doesn't realize my superiority. And that pops my bubble. How can I ever be satisfied as long as someone out there doesn't realize how much lower than I am they are? His plan then, actually it wasn't even his plan. This is sick and twisted. It's his wife's plan. Verse 14. Then said Zeresh his wife and all his friends unto him. These are enablers, and like attracts like. Well, let a gallows be made of 50 cubits high, and tomorrow speak thou unto the king that Mordecai may be hanged thereon. Then go thou in merrily with the king unto the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. This is a brutal verse. In Haman, we went from a prideful glee, look how much better I am than everyone, down to this jealous devastation of, but Mordecai, and then back to an even more wicked glee when his horrible wife suggests a 50-foot gallows to hang Mordecai from. And then you can go merrily back to the king, kind of skip away from the scene of execution. By the way, other translations don't speak of a 50-cubit gallows to be hanged upon, but rather a 50-cubit spike to be impaled upon. I guess pick your poison. Either way, 50 cubits is 75 feet tall, give or take. Again, wanting to be seen, I want to be above, rise above everyone. Well, I want my enemy, the one that I want to put so low. I actually want to bring him as high as possible so the world has something to look at. And he can be the cautionary tale to warn people against ever messing with me. Oh, you wouldn't bow down before me? Fine, I will raise you up in your own death. We already saw that Mordecai and Esther are a perfect match. Well, Haman and Zeresh seem to be a perfect match for each other as well. Chapter 6, though, we shift back to Mordecai. And notice what happens here. The plot continues to thicken. Verse 1, on that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. I mean, nothing quite like reading history to someone to put them to sleep. Kind of like I've been doing to you for the last 6 months. Well, if you're still awake, thank you for bearing with me. In the king's case, as he's listening to, insomnia, listening to this history drone on, all of a sudden it gets to some current events and he realizes, wait a minute, I was saved by Mordecai, the Jew. He was the one that alerted Queen Esther, who then told me about the plot that was being hatched among my own servants to conspire against me. Wow. In verse 3, he asks, what honor and dignity have been done to Mordecai for this? Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, there is nothing done for him. Oh, well, shame on me. I guess I was so relieved that I survived the assassination attempt that I just kind of moved on with my life since I had one and didn't realize that I owed that life to someone that I could have done something to honor. Yeah, let's right that wrong, shall we? I'm actually starting to kind of like King Ahasuerus. I wonder if Esther has been a good influence on him, and he's starting to think about other people for a change. Well, he goes and asks his advisors, what kinds of things should we do to honor someone? Now, Haman happened to get there right as this question was raised. He actually had come with a question of his own. He was going to ask the king, hey, do you mind if I string up Mordecai on a 75-foot gallows or impale him on a 75-foot spike? But he didn't get to his question before King Ahasuerus got to his. And who better to ask about worldly promotions than Haman, who always seems to be after more of them? Okay, verse 6, what shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now, he's being vague. We've seen a lot of that vagueness. There's this guy I want, this friend, quote unquote, that I really want to honor. Any idea, Haman, what would kind of go the distance? What would make the biggest difference for someone that I would want to honor? And as self-centered as always, Haman thought in his heart, well, to whom would the king delight to honor more than to myself? I mean, if there's anything good that's going to come to somebody, why not me? I'm obviously the most deserving of it. I mean, it's ironic that there are some people in the world that anytime there is laughter, they automatically assume, uh-oh, they're laughing at me. That's the self-deprecating sort. But then there's another group of people out there that anytime anyone is cheering, they automatically assume it must be something that I've done. And that's pride speaking. Well, here's pride personified, and he's thinking, oh, well, you mean I get to make my own wish list? The king obviously wants to honor me, and I can tell him exactly what will bring me the most honor. Fantastic. Now, just like with King Solomon, you could see a lot into his heart when we see what he asked for. Well, now we get to see into Haman's heart, if he has one, to try to make sense of what matters most to him. Well, here it is, verse 7 through 9. His grand and glorious idea. First, let the royal apparel be brought, which the king useth to wear. And next, the horse that the king rideth upon. Next, the crown royal, which is set upon his head. And then let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man withal whom the king delighteth to honor. and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth to honor. Now think about that and what it says about Haman. Again, let's go back to Solomon and use him as a comparison. What did Solomon ask for? Wisdom. Why? So I'd be known as the wisest of all men. Well, he ended up being known for that, but that wasn't why he was asking for it. He had nobler, purer motives. I need wisdom to be able to guide and direct and judge my people. I need largeness of heart as the sands of the sea. Please help me be a good leader. See, it wasn't about him, it was about others. More used would I be, right? That's not Haman at all. It's all about himself. It's all about, not more used would I be, but more known would I be, more honored would I be. And then remember what the Lord said to Solomon? He compared that righteous desire to some less righteous desires, some more selfish ones. And the three he listed was, wow, you didn't ask for riches. That's usually the first thing they ask for when they rub the genie, they rub the lamp and the genie comes out. Second, you didn't ask for long life for yourself. And thirdly, you didn't ask for your enemies to fall before you. Interesting. Well, I'm going to let you have all those three things because they'll be safe with you, Solomon. But good choice as far as number one was concerned. Compare that now to Haman. And part of me thinks, well, riches, why didn't he ask for that? Well, he already had them. He's the one that's going to shell out 10,000 talents of silver as an investment on getting more of the Jewish spoil. Now, he's the one that goes home and brags to his friends and his wife about all the glory of his wealth. I don't need that. It'll come with my anti-Jewish investment anyway. Number two, long life. Well, if there's one thing that you know about self-centered, prideful people, it's that they feel invincible. So I don't need to ask for long life. I mean, who would ever think about allowing me to die? Oh, I don't know. I live forever. And third, the lives of my enemies. The king already promised me that. And as soon as D-Day comes on the unlucky 13th, all the Mordecais in the world will bow before me as I slaughter them. So what's left then? I've got everything. I only need one more wish from the genie, and it's for the genie to come and turn me into a king. Or at least make people think that I am one. Because that's everything that he's asking for. I want the royal clothing. I want to dress like a king. I want the royal horse. I want to ride through town like a king. I want the royal crown. In fact, I want one of the king's most noble princes. Get the best you can think of and then still put him beneath me. How's that? Then I'll keep rising in elevation and estimation in front of everyone. Have that noble prince act like my humble servant. That's how much above them I am. And have them go lead me through town, shouting out for all to hear, this is what the king does for those who he delights to honor. Oh, yes. That's what I need. I'm surprised he didn't climb that 75-foot gallows just to look down on the people of Shushan from his lofty height. Oh, he intended that. This is pride personified. I just want to be seen of men. Well, verse 10. Sounds good to me. The king said to Haman, make haste, take the apparel and the horse, as thou hast said, and do even so to Mordecai the Jew that sitteth at the king's gate. Let nothing fail of all that thou hast spoken. It's like, that's the best idea I've ever heard. Man, I guess I kind of have all those things myself. I take the royal robes for granted. It's all I ever wear. And my horse, it's fine. I can stay in the palace one day. I don't need it. And if you want to look like a little mini me, I'm flattered. So yeah, go do it for Mordecai the Jew. That must have been the most painful irony for Haman to ever hear. What? To him, the person who is so far beneath me but doesn't act like it and doesn't realize it, and now I have to pretend like I'm beneath him, this would hurt and cut to the very core. Now notice what King Ahasuerus called him, do so to Mordecai the Jew. No wonder Haman had to be vague and say, oh, there's this certain people that are different and rebellious and need to be put down. Because King Ahasuerus seems to have no problem with Jews at all. Mordecai the Jew, yeah, set him up as a mini-me and little king for a day and treat him, to spoil him the way you described. Verse 11, then took Haman the apparel and the horse and arrayed Mordecai, probably plugging his nose and muttering under his breath the whole time, and brought him on horseback through the street of the city and proclaimed before him, probably with no small amount of sarcasm dripping from his teeth, thus shall it be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor. Actually, the fact he could even bring himself to say it suggests he was probably just dreaming of the day when he'd be the one receiving the royal treatment. Oh, it's just a matter of time. The roles will be reversed. And you'll be in your grave, Mordecai, while I'm on the king's horse. In fact, maybe someday I'll be on the king's throne. There have been other servants that have plotted conspiracies against him after all. Well, verse 12. When it's all done, Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hasted to his house, mourning and having his head covered. So interesting, the different reactions of these two. They've been side by side on several occasions. And it's always Haman trying to force Mordecai down. This time, he disgustingly had to lift and raise Mordecai up. But as soon as that king for a day experience is over, what does Mordecai do? He goes back to life as normal. He comes again to the king's gate where he was always just checking in on Esther and making sure everything was okay for her. He treated that king for a day as if it meant nothing to him and went right back to his old life without a second thought. That's humility, unaffected by the praise of the world. As opposed to Haman, who goes back home. I mean, first of all, can you imagine if roles had been reversed? And some mighty prince, at least that's probably something on his mind. Okay, the king did say, I suggested have the greatest of your princes prance him around on this horse. And he picked me. So I guess I really am, I knew that, I mean, obviously, but I guess the king finally realizes it as well, that I am the noblest of his princes. So I'll take that as a compliment. Again, maybe that's how he endured the experience for the day. But if it had been him on the horse instead of the one leading it, you better believe he would have been milking that for all it was worth. The guy that reminds his wife how many kids they have is going to keep bringing up his king for a day experience every time he's ever with her or with his friends. I don't know how they ever put up with him. But instead, because it wasn't him on horseback, he comes home absolutely devastated. Humility isn't affected by pride. Pride is over-affected by humiliation. So then verse 13, Haman told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had befallen him. He's probably seeking their pity as well as their outrage, hoping it'll match his own. But then said his wise men and Zeresh his wife unto him, and this is interesting what they say, if Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, we're starting to see the writing on the wall here, then thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him. If this is just preview of coming attractions, you had planned to hoist him upon the 75-foot gallows. Instead, you lifted him up onto the king's own horse. We're a bit superstitious around here. We've cast the Purim, after all, to land upon our unlucky 13. Maybe this is providence prophesying. You see, if the Jews have been living among them and there are these prophecies of a remnant returning, some have gone back with Zerubbabel, some will soon go back with Ezra. If people in Persia know some of these prophecies, they know what Cyrus had said about the return of the Jews and the building of a temple to their God. Do Persians know that the Jews have a promising future? And to have your own wise men and wife bring that up as a possibility? Ooh, that's not what I want to hear. Verse 14, well, glad I have good news to get my mind off of the subject. While they were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlains and hasted to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared. Oh, again, literarily, right on cue. You ready to, I mean, in some ways, Haman is being put on the ultimate emotional roller coaster with ups and downs, incredible heights of self-aggrandized glory, and then precipitous drops to just feeling, I can't believe I've been reduced to this level. Oh, well, now let's yank it back up and climb the next peak and come to the banquet of Esther. Actually, let's just call it the banquet of Haman, since that's really what it is intended to be, right? Chapter 7, let's watch it unfold. They're at the banquet. The king asks Esther a third time, what do you want? I'll give you half the kingdom if you so desire. But then again, as far as Esther's concerned, what would half the kingdom mean when you have a death sentence staring you in the face? Verse 3, she finally says to him, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, there's the I'm worthy to receive side of it. And if it please the king, there's the thy will be done side of it. Then please, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. You see, this is really the first time that it's going to start dawning on the king, wait a minute, your people, what are you talking about? Your people are my people. We're all the same, right? We're all Persians. Esther, Ishtar, I mean, I married our goddess, and you are that to me. So what are you talking about? Well, I'm not your people. I'm God's people. I'm Jehovah's people. I'm Hadassah. I'm a Hebrew. And my people have had the sentence of death passed upon them as far as your empire extends. What am I to do? The way she says it at the end, if we'd been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I would have held my tongue. Interesting, her own humility here. If it was only slavery we were facing, I wouldn't have said a word. We've been through that before as a people. We had 4 centuries worth of slavery in Egypt, and we came out stronger than ever. And I know God would preserve us if we at least lived long enough for him to do so. But it's worse than this. What's about to happen to us is worse than slavery, because at least slaves are sold alive. We are being sold into death. And what are they getting? All of our possessions, the spoils of war, a war we're not allowed to fight. So, verse 5, how does the king respond? He answers and says unto Esther the queen, who is he? Where is he that doth presume in his heart to do so? I can't imagine who would possibly do such a thing. And the queen answers in verse 6, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. And that's when everything changes. This is the moment where the plot shifts. This is the crescendo and the climax, and all of a sudden Haman goes dropping off the edge of this roller coaster and going from I've come to be the one who the king honors to the one who the king knows is public enemy number 1. I did this. The verse ends, then Haman was afraid before the king and the queen. What a dramatic plot reversal. Verse 7, the king arising from the banquet of wine, it's always present, in his wrath went into the palace garden. He's just going outside to cool off, that how could this happen? My own right-hand man would go against my wife and her people? Haman, meanwhile, stood up to make request for his life to Esther the queen. He's still in the room with her, for he saw that there was evil determined against him by the king. Oh, well, glad you have a fine grasp of the obvious, Haman. Verse 8, then the king returned out of the palace garden into the place of the banquet of wine, and Haman was fallen upon the bed whereon Esther was. There he is begging for his life, pleading for his own preservation. But what does it look like when the king comes back in from the garden and sees Haman there on the bed with his wife? He says to him, will he force the queen also before me in the house? And as the word went out of the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Oh, this is not good optics. What are you doing, Haman? It's bad enough that you wanted to kill my wife and her people. Are you going to rape her first? Oh, it's actually interesting to compare this with the earlier experiences with Vashti, where it was Ahasuerus who was willing to objectify his wife and just let his drunken friends ooh and ah over her beauty. Oh, there's no objectification of Esther here. He's accusing basically Haman of doing just that. And you will not do this to my wife or to her people. In verse 9 and 10, Harbona, one of the chamberlains, said before the king, oh, behold also the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai, who had spoken good for the king. It happens to stand in the house of Haman. Oh, how's that for coincidence? And the king said, hang him thereon. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then was the king's wrath pacified. So many role reversals through this great book of Scripture. Remember the verse that speaks of woe unto those that will dig a pit for their neighbor because they'll fall into it themselves? Well, this is a little more graphic than that. But Haman hanged on the gallows meant for Mordecai, or impaled upon the pike, 75 feet high. Oh, he wanted the people to look up to him. They did, that's for sure. Stretching, craning their neck, stretching, looking upwards, straining their eyes, wondering, who is, oh my goodness, that's Haman. What has he done? In a way, this is another example of that enforced empathy we saw back in Exodus and elsewhere. You, wouldn't feel for someone else, then you'll feel like them. In fact, it's a weird twisted way, or twist on the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Well, that's what happened. You wanted to do that to Mordecai. Well, it was done to you instead. And if that's where we leave Haman, then where does that leave Mordecai? Remember, thanks to that nocturnal history lesson, the king has nothing but good feelings towards Mordecai. I know he's Jewish, that's no problem. Now I know my wife's Jewish too. Interesting connections here. Chapter 8, verse 1, on that day did the king Ahasuerus give the house of Haman the Jew's enemy unto Esther the queen. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was unto her. She's revealing all kinds of things. She's taking off the Purim costumes. Yes, I'm Jewish. And Mordecai is actually my cousin / father figure. I was raised by him. And the king couldn't be more pleased. He took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it unto Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Yet more role reversals. Haman sank while he was trying to rise. Mordecai rose when he never tried to do so directly. All he ever did was bow before God. But God lifted him up. His humility elevated him, whereas Haman's pride went before his fall. There's actually a beautiful quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of Joseph Smith's contemporaries, who said, "The mass of men worry themselves into nameless graves, while here and there a great unselfish soul forgets himself into immortality." And that describes Mordecai beautifully. One who forgot himself into immortality. We still know his name and know his story. But his people still aren't out of danger yet. We could stop the story here and things look good for Esther and Mordecai. But what about the Jewish people scattered throughout the Persian Empire? Verse 3, Esther spake yet again before the king. There's no stopping her now. Okay? I'm less concerned about surviving his presence. The golden scepter seems to be extended permanently. She falls down at his feet and besought him with tears to put away the mischief of Haman the Agagite and his device that he had devised against the Jews. Then the king held out the golden scepter toward Esther, as before. So Esther arose and stood before the king. Now, like I said, this is the second time this has occurred for Esther, but it's the one that she's been hoping for all along. The first was just to soften the king's heart and set up Haman for what he was, and these days of banqueting did all of that. But keep reading and look at verse 5. She's going to ask her real question. In the same format she always seems to. If it please the king, so there's your will. If I have found favor in his sight, there's my worthiness. And the king seem right before thee, let me repeat your will. And I be pleasing in his eyes, let me repeat my worthiness. Then please, let it be written to reverse the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews which are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that shall come upon my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? You see, it wasn't just about her, it was about her people. That's her biggest concern. Even if I can remain safe in the palace, there has to be enlargement and deliverance for my people. And please can it come through you, mighty king. But here's the problem. Remember, the laws of the Medes and the Persians are irrevocable. You can't reverse them, and that's what she asked for. Can you reverse the letters that Haman wrote under your name and with your seal? The king responds in verse 8, write ye also for the Jews, as it liketh you. So however you want to do this. In the king's name, seal it with the king's ring. Mordecai's got it now. For the writing which is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring may no man reverse. I'm sorry, I can't change this. But I can... this is so interesting as far as what the king's solution is. We can't take back the first writing, but we can counteract the first writing with a second writing. I hate to break it to you that yes, your lives are in danger on the 13th day, but maybe we can counteract that by allowing you to defend yourselves. At least let's make this a fair fight then. There was nothing fair about the attacks against you. Let's make it fair to defend yourself and fight back. So Mordecai writes this message. He sends it abroad as far and as wide as Haman's message had gone. He has it translated into all the languages of the realm, just as before. He seals it with the king's name and the king's ring and everything else. And in it, verse 11, the king granted the Jews, which were in every city, to gather themselves together and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, to cause to perish. It's the same language we saw in the first one. All the power of the people and province that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. It's amazing how similar the second one is to the first. It's not reversing it, but it's almost giving it a mirror image. And in some ways, I think that's great counsel when it comes to opposing the opposition that we have to face. We saw a lot of that last week with Ezra and Nehemiah, and how do we overcome the opposition that's being thrown all around us? How do we fight history with history, for example? In this, how do we fight attacks? Well, I wouldn't say with counterattacks, at least in our day. That was an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth kind of period. We don't have to bash someone who's bashed us, but we can fight misinformation with information. We can dispel darkness by bringing in light. We can't delete from the internet all the anti-Mormonism that's there. Okay, it's out there. It's kind of like what Joseph Smith described, though, at the beginning of Joseph Smith history. He says, I'm writing this history to disabuse the public mind. The public mind has been abused with misinformation. And how do I disabuse it? I can't cause them to forget what they've read or heard about me. But if I can give them something more accurate, and they can read or hear this, then we'll have to just trust that they'll be discerning and make the right decision and come away with the right second impression if the first one was so flawed. I think there's value there, and I think there's an example that we can follow, that when someone attacks us, we can't eliminate the attack, but we can respond in such a way that people begin to trust us more than our attackers. And I think that's good advice to follow. In verse 15, that seems to be Mordecai's approach, at least. Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, and with a great crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. This is actually very similar to the king for a day experience he already had. But this is no longer king for a day. This is king's right-hand man, basically for the rest of our story today. And whereas Shushan was, or the people of Shushan were perplexed that the Jews were ever deemed an enemy, now they are rejoicing and filled with gladness to see a Jew treated like royalty. Again, it's a matter of fighting darkness with light. We're not your enemy. You don't have to attack us. We are one among you. We are one with you. We are trusted by your own king. And we pray we can be trusted by you as well. Now, is that going to work for everyone? What about all these provinces that are further away and aren't seeing all of this? Well, we'll see what unfolds in just a moment. But notice verse 16 and 17. Despite the gathering darkness, the Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness. A feast and a good day. I love that. It's a pretty good day. Yeah, you think? Talk about the understatement of the 5th century BC. In some ways, in this book full of role reversals, there's a reversal of sentiments, because they went from darkness to light. They went from devastation to gladness. They went from fear to joy. And they went from feeling like the absolute lowest to becoming a people of honor. And even when it says they had a feast, remember the 3 days of fasting? Now it's time for feasting. And that 13th was going to be the ultimate day of destruction. Well, the day they get the news that they can fight back, that they can defend themselves, well, there's a good day, if ever there was one. The next verse is even more interesting. And many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. Now, is that fear in terms of they can defend themselves and they're probably going to kill us instead of us killing them? Well, better to, if you can't beat them, then join them? Or is this fear as in reverence, that our own king seems to revere Mordecai? In fact, the Jews must be amazing if he's promoting a Jew as his right-hand man, and he's got a Jew in the palace as his right-hand woman. Is the word spreading now that Hadassah is the real identity of Esther? And the people of Jehovah, they are rising in the ranks among the Persians as well. And these people, despite the danger that the Jews were facing, now people are joining them. It's actually one of my favorite things about opposition, that it's often the evidence that the truth is at work. It sometimes offends the sensibilities of good people as they start feeling, why are people picking on the Latter-day Saints? I mean, that was one of the things that convinced Oliver Cowdery's brother to join the church eventually, or ultimately, finally. He sees all this Missouri persecution, and it softens his heart in a way that his own brother's personal experiences and testimony hadn't done. Or the story of an amazing young woman who went to see the Book of Mormon musical on Broadway and came out and was so disgusted by it all that she wanted to see what the real story of Mormonism was all about. And once she read the real Book of Mormon, she knew it was true and she joined the church. I mean, it's interesting that sometimes our opposers can then become our promoters, and that people that one day were going to fight against the Jews find themselves becoming Jews the next day. Well, this is worthy of rejoicing, and it's a time to celebrate. And so chapter 9 of Esther, as we approach the end of our story, is where we get this Feast of Purim. Verse 1, now in the 12th month, that is the month Adar, on the 13th day of the same. This is the great and dreadful day of the Lord, in a way. This is the day that the house of Israel is supposed to be destroyed, but instead will be preserved. When the king's commandment and his decree drew near to be put in execution, in the day that the enemies of the Jews hoped to have power over them, though it was turned to the contrary, that the Jews had rule over them that hated them. I love that phrase. It was turned to the contrary. That's exactly what will happen at the second coming. As the wicked, who seemed to rejoice over the righteous, will find themselves on the short end of that stick with a role reversal with eternal consequences. To see the negativity that they faced and the opposition that they endured turned to the contrary, it's amazing how good God is at that. Of taking ashes and turning it to the contrary and giving beauty. Of taking the crucifixion and turning it to the contrary in the resurrection. To take the martyrdom of Joseph Smith and Hiram and turning it to the contrary as it fortified the faith of their followers. To take the suffering of the pioneers and turning it to the contrary as, iron wills were forged in those fires of faith. I don't know what the future holds specifically in the aftermath of this time period of such secularization and loss of faith in the world. But I do have faith in a God who turns things to the contrary. As Elder Maxwell once said, how ironic that the so-called post-Christian era will come to an end with the coming of Christ. There is the great and dreadful day of the Lord, and it will be great for the righteous, dreadful for the wicked. There is something of an Armageddon here in verse 2 and 3. The Jews gathered themselves together in their cities throughout all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus to lay hand on such as sought their hurt. They are defending themselves as the decree gave them permission to do. And no man could withstand them. They're fighting for their lives here. For the fear of them fell upon all people, and all the rulers of the provinces, and the lieutenants, and the deputies, and officers of the king helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. They honor and revere Mordecai just like the king seems to. And so the people that at one point could have, and probably would have, turned on the Jews, now turn to join them, and end up defending them against their enemies. This is a complete turning of the tables. And there's more of that to come. Verse 4, Mordecai, who was always seen so lowly, outside the gate of the palace, is now great in the king's house. And his fame went out throughout all the provinces. For this man Mordecai waxed greater and greater. A reversal of fortunes for him, a reversal of fortunes for his people. Well, the Jews defeat their enemies that day. And in fact, remember when Haman kept bragging about the size of his family, the number of his posterity? Well, he had 10 sons, and they were all slain on that day. In a way, this ends the line of this Agagite, which is what Saul was supposed to do centuries before. It took a later Benjamite to accomplish that work. But now it's done. His line has ended. It's like Goliath killed by David, but then his sons killed throughout Philistia as well. In some ways, what I think the Lord is hinting at here is the day of righteousness will come. The day of enlargement and deliverance will come. And it will spell the absolute end of the opposition that you have faced through all of your history. That is cause to celebrate indeed. But just to be sure, and this is where the story gets a little interesting, Esther asks the king for one more request. will you allow us to extend our decree by one day? So not just on the 13th can we defend ourselves against our enemies, but can we do it again on the 14th? Now, this is tricky because some have considered this absolutely unjustifiable violence. You've defeated your enemies. It's all good. You've got your enemy, you got your foot on their neck. Let it go. And so is Esther just bloodthirsty? And hey, look at all we did today. Let's just extend it for another 24 hours. If it is, then that was wrong. And you went beyond eye for an eye. And you're being unjust in your vengeance. On the other hand, and I would hope that we can, Esther has proven that she deserves us the benefit of the doubt. I would say the same for Mordecai. And so it makes me wonder, do they know something that we don't? In fact, if there was just a day to fight the Jews, are the ones most against them going to just hide out now that they know that, well, they can fight back? But just this one day, let's lie low for the 13th and come and attack them tomorrow. I don't know all the reasons, but if we are extending some grace here and trying to understand, there does come this second day. And to me, if nothing else, is it God's way of reassuring us that there will come a time where all evil is ended. It's all behind you. The great and dreadful day, or days, if more than one are needed, has passed. And you never have to worry again about people coming after you. Remember, this could have spelled the end of the Jewish people as we know it. No righteous remnant. And instead, it's going to be the absolute end of the opposition. We see that in verse 16. The Jews throughout the empire gathered themselves together and stood for their lives and had rest from their enemies. In verse 17, they made it a day of feasting and gladness like before. In 19, it was a day of gladness and feasting and a good day and of sending portions one to another. That's why on Purim they do just that. They send portions one to another. They give food to others. They provide for the poor and the needy. It's trick-or-treating with no tricks. It's all treats because God has delivered us. It's amazing what the change that took place because of one young woman with the courage to stand. Well, Mordecai establishes these 2 days as days of celebration forever after. And in verse 22, as the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, from mourning into a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, instead of fasting and sorrow, and of sending portions one to another and gifts to the poor. It's role reversal all over again. The poor will be provided for. The lowly will be lifted. The prideful will be brought low. Every valley shall be exalted, and the mountains brought low, the crooked straight, and the rough places plain. That's the millennial reign. That's the celestial kingdom. That's the last shall be first, and the first shall be last. That's God stepping in and fixing all that's gone wrong in life. And that's the celebration of Purim. In verse 24, because Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had devised against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast Pur, that is the lot, to consume them, and to destroy them. No wonder, verse 26, wherefore they called these days Purim, after the name of Pur. The lots, im is the plural ending, so casting lots. And it's been celebrated as a day of deliverance ever since. It was Haman that cast those lots, hoping that providence would step in. Well, providence did. Not on Haman's side, though, but on the side of the people of God. His hand is shining through the experiences of this incredible book. I hope that we've seen him. Chapter 9 ends then with verse 28. These days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, every family, every province, every city, and that these days of Purim should not fail from among the Jews, nor the memorial of them perish from their seed. Now you see why they keep celebrating it every year? Why, as a college student 25 years ago, I got to go and participate on that night of celebration, booing and hissing every time I heard Haman's name. And the more you know his story, the more sincere those boos and hiss come. This is a chance for Jews to pass down their sacred past. And as members of the house of Israel, it's our sacred past as well. Are we passing down traditions to honor our pioneer forefathers? Do we take a moment on December 23rd to think about the birth of the prophet Joseph? Do we celebrate Easter and Christmas in the ways that remind our children and all of us the real meaning behind those days? Oh, yes, you'll go ahead and have fun and get dressed up and make your noisemakers. But more than anything, share your portion. Give your good gifts. Recognize the hand of God in all of this. Reread your scripture. They read it in its entirety. And by the time they get to this point where they realize we're doing this, we're fulfilling this command, then there's only one little chapter left. Just 3 short verses. In Esther chapter 10, where it all comes full circle. We started chapter 1 meeting Ahasuerus in all of his glory, and we end in chapter 10 with another nod to the king's almighty power. But that power, or that spotlight, quickly shifts back from Ahasuerus to Mordecai. And we get the last word of this chapter about him. In verse 2, the attention has turned to the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereunto the king advanced him. And then verse 3, the whole book ends, for Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, rather than his own, which is what Haman would have done, and speaking peace to all his seed, instead of fomenting violence as Haman had tried. And the story ends. Ironically, the book of Esther ends with Mordecai. How does that work? I thought we were getting past this gender imbalance and giving women their rightful due. Well, we are. But I think there's something to this ending with Mordecai. You see, as we've seen throughout the Old Testament, there are types and shadows of Christ everywhere we look. And there are both male and female types of and shadows of the Savior. I think we typically see Esther, since she's the star of our story, and star is what her name means, but surely she is the Messiah figure in this story. And she is. She is a mediator for her people. She goes and faces the powers that be to be able to defend her people. She's willing to die, if necessary, to preserve them. She knows that enlargement and deliverance will come through her efforts, if it be God's will. In fact, it happened on the 3rd day, as she was facing the possibility of death, and yet life emerged on that 3rd day instead. Even the phrase in chapter 7, verse 3 that we read, "Let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request," that made perfect sense for Esther literally. Preserve me as a Jew, preserve my people who are Jews as well. But if we take her as a type and shadow of Christ, he couldn't ask for both. He could not ask for his deliverance as well as his people's deliverance. It would be one or the other. And Christ gratefully put our life first and was willing to die that we might live. Yes, Esther is an incredible type and shadow of Jesus. She is a Messiah in this chapter. But so is Mordecai. Rethink the story and put him, since we ended with him, we're meant to leave this story with him and his example lingering in our minds. And so Mordecai is a Messiah figure as well. He's the only one who never bowed to Haman. He is singled out as Haman's greatest enemy. A gallows was set up for him, and yet it was the enemy that was placed upon it. Remember the first messianic prophecy that the serpent will bruise the Messiah's heel, but the Messiah will crush the serpent's head? That's what happened on the gallows of Christ, on the cross. Mordecai was given authority by the king. In fact, he was arrayed in royal apparel. The city rejoiced at his coming. He was second only to the king, and he blessed all the people, and the people blessed him. Yes, Mordecai is an amazing Messiah figure in this narrative. But if he's a type and shadow of Christ, then do we have to recast Esther? And the beauty of symbolism is it can represent so many things and so many layers to it. But if we allow Mordecai to play the part of Messiah in this setting, can we recast Esther in a second role? She can assume them both. But she can now be recast as the house of Israel itself, as all of us. That we are each Esther here. And it is Mordecai who watches over and guides and directs each of us. She is cast in the role of a bride, after all, in this story. And here we are, the house of Israel, the bride of Christ, trying to prepare ourselves to wear the beautiful white raiment. It's probably going to take more than 12 months of purification on our part, and all kinds of myrrh and sweet savor, and anything else that we can do to prepare ourselves for that rendezvous with the Redeemer, the marriage supper of the King of Kings. We, like her, didn't come from an ideal situation. She had no parents that she knew of, but was raised by someone who loved her and cared for her. Oh, Israel itself, we're not better than any other people. We have our own lowly beginnings, but God has chosen us for a wise purpose in him. Esther always obeyed Mordecai's commands. Anything he suggested, she saw the wisdom of it and responded accordingly. She saw it as her responsibility to deliver others. And as members of the house of Israel, that is our role. The baptismal font is the burden we bear on our backs, and we are meant to gather Israel on both sides of the veil. My friends, we can do as the Lord commands. We can follow the counsel of the man Mordecai. We can choose to stand up and be different from the wicked world. We can have the courage to recognize that we're Hadassah and not Esther, that we are house of Israel and not the people of Persia. More than anything, we can make sure that deliverance and enlargement comes. We can have the courage to say, if I perish, I perish. Socially, economically, whatever it might be, but to live in such a way that we bear witness to the fact that God indeed has saved us for this final dispensation. That we can do the work that he has laid out for us in our time and in our place. That we can look in the mirror and see a Hadassah staring back, reassuring us that yes, indeed, we have been sent to the kingdom for such a time as this.